On Tuesday, NASA began another practice launch countdown as it eyes the potential launch next month of Artemis II, the first mission in decades to carry Americans around the moon. Returning to the moon is part of a larger plan to establish a long-term human presence on the lunar surface and to eventually do the same thing on Mars. While such a vision may make it sound like space colonization's right around the corner, there is still a lot that we just don't know about how living in space, on the moon, or on Mars long-term will affect human beings. Rice University biology professor Scott Solomon's been thinking a lot about that. He digs into the subject in his new book. It's called Becoming Martian: How Living in Space Will Change Our Bodies and Minds. Scott, welcome to Houston Matters.
Hi, Craig. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. And as we chat, we welcome your questions and comments for our guests. You can call or text 713-440-8870. You can email us at talk@houstonmatters.org. You can also reach out on Houston Public Media's YouTube channel. Check out our chat below the video stream there. We've had humans on the International Space Station for a lot of years now.
Yeah.
Some have been up there as long as a year, maybe even a little bit more in a couple of cases, but you're talking about much longer than that, right?
Well, I think that is the eventual goal, right? So the record is currently 437 days is the most that a single person has spent continuously in space. That was on the Russian space station Mir. But yeah, the International Space Station, as you said, it's been continuously occupied since 2000. So in a sense, the entire 21st century so far, we have had humans living in space. Not the same humans, but, somebody's been up there.
So there are, and we've been able to identify some impacts, primarily temporary, I think, for those who have lived a year or more in space. We talk about how, when they land, they're a little taller briefly, things
That's right.
like that.
Yeah.
What don't we know about how living in space or on the moon or Mars for years and years, maybe decades, maybe an entire lifetime, could affect us?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. So, for example, one of the more famous studies of what happens to a human body in space was when astronaut Scott Kelly spent about a year on the International Space Station. And this was really kind of a cool study because Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, is his twin brother, also a former astronaut, and he stayed on Earth during that same time. So they had kind of a built-in experimental control. And they did all sorts of studies to look at what exactly was happening. But here's the thing. The International Space Station is in low Earth orbit. So we think about it as being, really far up. It's in space. It's about 250 miles up. But it's actually still close enough to Earth that it's inside of the magnetosphere. That's the protective magnetic field that surrounds our planet. And it actually shields us from a lot of the more intense forms of radiation that are deeper in space. So when we go to the moon, as the Artemis II astronauts are about to do, they're going beyond the magnetosphere. They're going into the parts of space that have that really intense radiation. And we just don't have as much information about what that kind of radiation does to the body.
Also, when we talk about the moon and we talk about Mars, we need to talk about gravity.
That's right.
While I think most people understand what gravity means on Earth and understand that in outer space, you're in 0G, no gravity. The moon has about 1/6, I think it is,
That's right.
of the Earth's gravity. Mars has about 1/3.
Yep.
What could that mean long term if somebody lives under those conditions for years and years?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the really important things that we need to better understand. Because here's the thing, with radiation, there are ways that you can protect people from radiation exposure. So if we're going to be spending a long amount of time on the moon or on Mars, one of the easiest ways to shield people is just to go underground, to just pile up some of the regolith, the sort of soil on top of your habitat, and that'll block a lot of the radiation. But the gravity, that's a much harder problem to solve. You can't easily make artificial gravity. And the thing is that, as you pointed out, the astronauts that go to the International Space Station, most of our experience with having people in space has been in a weightless environment. We say 0G, it's not technically no gravity, but that's what the body is experiencing. And that 1/6 G on the moon is, of course, more than a weightless experience, but it's not as much as a 1G Earth gravity. And we actually don't know that much about partial gravity, about what happens between 0 and 1G. And we know, very little about 1/3 G. So that's one of the things that I point out in my new book, is that we actually need a lot more science on partial gravity to know what that will do to people.
Well, and what that will do to people under a variety of circumstances, some of which we can predict, some of which we can't. One, I think we could probably predict. If we're talking about decades, potentially, if we're talking about colonizing Mars, for instance, or long-term space travel to there or anywhere, and you're talking about years and years in space. For that to work, you kind of have to have kids in space.
That's right.
How does something like that affect pregnancy?
Oh, my gosh. So I think this is the potential showstopper for plans to actually live on the moon or Mars or anywhere in deep space. Because the reality is that we have very little information about how human reproduction would work in that lower gravity environment, higher radiation environment, all of the extremes of being out there in space. There have been some studies looking at animals on the International Space Station and going back to the space shuttle days. There have been some studies on fish, some on amphibians, a little bit of work with rodents, but not enough for us to really be able to say, yes, reproduction in space is possible, or even to say, well, there's some challenges and these are the specific challenges. We actually really know very little about that. So pregnancy, as you pointed out, is a question. Childbirth is a question. And then child development, right? I mean, what happens we know that the astronauts in space, they start to lose bone density at a rate of about 1.5 to 2% bone density per month in space. That's a healthy adult. What happens to a child's growing body as they're building their skeleton? And is, again, 1/3 gravity on Mars or 1/6 gravity on the moon, is that enough for a child to fully form their skeleton or not? And if not, does that mean that a child born out there in space on the moon or on Mars would not ever be able to come back to Earth? I think we need to know that before it makes sense for us to start thinking about having kids there.
It sounds to me like we have lots and lots and lots of questions and very few answers.
Well, you're not wrong. I do try in the book to sort of say, here's what we know. And I try to also show how we know it. So I, went to the places where all the research is happening and try to kind of describe what that process is like, meet the people who are doing this research and tell their stories. But I also try to be very clear about what do we not know. And you're absolutely right that there are a lot of still unanswered questions. But then there's things that we can do by, essentially applying what we know about something that happens on Earth to think about how it could happen out in space.
Can you give some examples?
Absolutely. So I start to think about this from my perspective as an evolutionary biologist. That's my training. I did my dissertation research on the evolutionary origins of biodiversity in the Amazon basin, and I've worked on islands in the Pacific. And I think that we can apply what we know about evolutionary biology, especially on islands, to thinking about evolutionary changes that could happen to people living on the islands out there in space that we call planets. And so, there's things like species tend to change size when they're isolated on islands for long amounts of time. So you can think about Galapagos tortoises getting larger, or there's a lot of examples of types of elephants that got smaller. We got pygmy elephants because they were isolated on an island environment. So perhaps we could predict that future generations of Martians would actually be smaller. And there's other examples of that I get into in the book, but I try to essentially say, here's the things that we know happen in evolution when an organism is living in a isolated, extreme environment, and apply that to what could happen out there in space.
How quickly could that evolution take place?
Yeah, we tend to think of evolution as being a very slow process. But we actually now know that it can happen faster. And there's a couple of things that control kind of how fast evolution happens. One is basically like how different is the environment, right? So if you move into a much different environment from where you came from, then that tends to make natural selection operate in a faster way. The other is how much variation does natural selection have to work with, right? Natural selection can't make new variety. It can just sort through what's already there. And this is where I think actually radiation exposure becomes relevant again, because we know radiation causes damage to DNA. That can lead to mutations. Mutations are the raw material that natural selection actually can work with. So in a way, being out there in that high radiation environment could actually kickstart evolution and cause it to happen much faster than what we're used to thinking about here on Earth.
What might that look like?
Yeah, so that's the fun part of kind of it. It's very speculative. I get into some examples in the book about, there's ways in which you could imagine humans evolving to have larger heads, for example, because we were talking about pregnancy and childbirth earlier. There's a lot of scenarios in which childbirth becomes much riskier in a low gravity environment, right? Think about having weakened bones, right? And so perhaps all births start to be via C-section. That actually frees up the head to become larger because it doesn't have to fit through the birth canal anymore. So, you can think through like the logic of evolution and how we know it works to make kind of informed predictions about what could happen to future generations.
You're an evolutionary biologist. You're focused quite a bit on physical impacts, understandably so. Those are one thing. Psychological impacts are another. What are some of the questions that you're contemplating about how life in space or on the moon or on Mars might impact the human mind?
I think this is a really important thing to think about because, we know that going out into space has a profound psychological and emotional impact on people. I mean, astronauts talk about the experience of looking back at the Earth and being really transformed by it, right? You see how fragile the Earth is. You see how thin the atmosphere is. You recognize that, it's just one planet and we're all in it together. And so that's this idea known as the overview effect that really has kind of a profound, generally positive impact on people. Going deeper into space, imagine being out there on Mars and looking up in the night sky and just seeing this tiny little dot, and that's Earth. And it's so far away, and maybe it actually starts to make people appreciate what a good place to live the Earth really is, right? I mean, Mars is so extreme as an environment that it will really make even the most inhospitable places on Earth, like Antarctica, seem pretty cozy. So I think, there's those kinds of effects, but I think there's also the effects of, being in a confined space with a relatively small group of people for a long amount of time. Astronauts train with the same crew members in part for, the practical purposes of wanting to make sure they work together as a team. But you have to get those team dynamics right. And this is something NASA really thinks a lot about. And it's something that would be essential for being in an extreme environment very far from home and for a long period of time.
So many of us come to subject matter like this through the prism of science fiction. And so many science fiction stories, whether we're talking about books or TV or film or beyond, they kind of yada their way through a lot of the questions that you're asking. Is there anything out there in terms of science fiction that you'd point to and say, they may be closing in on getting it right?
Yeah, actually, I think a lot of science fiction has really done the hard work of thinking through what's possible, right? And sometimes it's creative and fun, and sometimes it's pretty well based on scientific principles. So I'm a big fan of The Expanse. That's a series that I think one of the things that they got right about it is the idea that people living in a lower gravity environment, in this case, the Belters are one of the groups of people who are living out there in space, and they have evolved to have kind of long, thin bodies and weaker bones. And so the idea of gravity torture plays a role in that story because people from the asteroid belt coming to Earth, Earth's gravity is essentially crushing them. And that's something that I think we would have to really understand if that would be the case for people living out there on the moon or Mars. But I also want to mention one of the oldest examples of science fiction, and that is H.G. Wells. He wrote this story, War of the Worlds, back in 1898. And, so spoiler alert if you haven't, if you're not familiar with the story, but it's been out for a while. So
yeah, I think you're safe.
But, in that story, you have Martians coming and basically attacking the Earth, and their technology is so superior and we can't stop them. But what ultimately stops them is bacteria. Earth's microorganisms. They have no defense against it. And I think that was actually a really forward-thinking idea, because I actually really worry quite a bit about the role of microorganisms in making it challenging for people to be able to easily move between planets. We will only have the microbes that we take with us when we go to the moon or Mars. And so a child born in that environment, they would never be exposed to the vast diversity of microbes that we have here on Earth that our immune systems are kind of trained to be able to deal with without it being a big deal.
In light of all of this, how far away are we really from colonizing Mars? Are we talking decades, centuries, millennia? Where would you put it?
So that's the thing, and this was part of my motivation for writing this book, is that, we are at a moment when people are actively working towards trying to make that happen soon, right? Elon Musk is saying we're going to have a self-growing city on the moon within 10 years and one on Mars within, 20 to 30.
Well, he says a lot of things.
Yeah, his timing is something that people are often skeptical of. But I think we need to be cautious about moving forward. I'm calling for us to keep doing the science, keep doing the exploration, but the idea of actually living there and having settlements where people are raising families, that's something I think that we need to hold off on until we really understand what the consequences would be for future generations born out there.
Scott Solomon is a biology professor at Rice University and the author of Becoming Martian: How Living in Space Will Change Our Bodies and Minds. Scott, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me on, Craig.